Greetings, family. Welcome to the African Exodus show. I'm your host, Tierney Cherie, here to you with a new video. Before we get started with today's segment, I want to remind you, if you have not, please do add yourself to my Telegram channel. That is the app that I primarily use. I'm just not following social media like that nowadays. But if you want to get updates on the videos when I post them, and YouTube is not good at giving notifications, or if you want to just stay connected, that's a good way to connect with me there. So today we're going to do the set apart segment. This segment, of course, is talking about being set apart from the world. Today's segment, though, we're going to talk about reasons, one of the big reasons why you might want to expedite your separateness from certain countries. So I understand a lot of people have an attitude that we should stay where we are, wherever we are in the world. So if you're in America, if you're in the West, stay there, because essentially you don't want to try to escape Babylon, escape the oppressive systems that we know are going to come down on your own. You want to wait for Yah to deliver you from those systems. I never took that view. I believe that absolutely Yah will deliver his people. But if you stay in a place that you know is targeted for judgment, then you might just fall with that shit. I mean, you might just go down. Sometimes you're just too close in proximity to the system. Your job is too close in proximity to the evilness, your actual place where your house is. You know, the ground is cursed in America. That's something we have to understand. Genocide isn't something that just gets erased. The ground is cursed for the things, the sins that have been committed against Yah's people. So it could be your proximity in that type of way. But overall, you know, I understand you have to hear from Yah, absolutely. But I would encourage you all, don't ignore where he actually does tell you that you might want to move out of the way. So today we're going to talk about World War III. Sometimes some of us are waiting for a voice to come from heaven, and I understand Yah speaks to different people in different ways. Maybe y'all have that type of relationship where he speaks to you like that. Understand, though, the scripture is him speaking. The scripture is literally him speaking. So to read directly from the scripture before we even get into the subject, I want to just set some context. This is Zechariah 2. We're going to read from verse 6, and I think we're going to go all the way to verse 8. You there, flee from the land of the north, declares Yahuwah, because I have spread you out like the four winds of heaven, declares Yahuwah. You, Zion, escape, you who are living with the daughter of Babylon. Next, we'll go on. For the Lord's army says, after glory, he has sent me against the nations to plunder you. For the one who touches you touches the apple of my eye. Now, some people want to argue that the daughter of Babylon is a spiritual system that comes from Babylon religion, notably the Catholic Church, the Vatican. But understand this, in this scripture does not talk about a spiritual system. It's saying flee from the land of the north. That is a place. Okay. And then it says also the daughter of Babylon. Babylon in scripture, yes, there is Babylon religion, but Babylon is always spoken about as a place. And we know that Babylon has different eras. We know that it starts off with the actual Babylon, and then it goes to different eras as far as the Medes and the Persians, the Syrian Empire. You have the Roman Empire. So we know that there are different eras, but guess what? Every one of those eras that are spoken about in the scripture reference a place. It's actually a kingdom, physical and spiritual. So to say that flee from the land of the north is not talking about Babylon. That to me is you trying to avoid the issue, that this is actually a place that needs to be understood, that is going to fall under Yah's judgment. But if you want to be sure that this is actually a end times prophecy, let's continue to read. Let's start with verse 11. Many nations will join themselves to the Lord on that day and will become my people. Then I will dwell in your midst, so that you know that Yahuwah of armies has sent me, and that Yahuwah possesses Judah as his portion in the Holy Land and will again choose Jerusalem. So this right here is talking about the end. We know in the end, Yahuwah will bring Israel back to the promised land, and that will be his kingdom from where Yeshua rules from. So I understand that this right here tells you that this is a future prophecy. This is not the Babylon of the past. If not, then he would not have spoken about the end, which is Israel going back to the promised land. So that is the basis for when we're going to start this conversation, because I understand a lot of people want to argue that it's not a physical place or that it's just a spiritual place, but scripture is very clear. Flee from the land of the north is very clear that you need to consider the country that you're in. If you were in a European or inside of a country like America that comes from the European system, if you're in those countries, you are seated in the daughter of Babylon. But with that basis, we're going to talk about World War III. We're going to go through a video right now that's going to give a simulation. Understand, this is not necessarily prophetic, although I always look at people who put out videos and put out messaging and movies that these people could absolutely have some type of foreseen certain things, especially when you understand that Hollywood operates in the occult. But this is not necessarily prophetic. This, though, is giving you a scenario of what World War III would look like, who would be the targets, what would be the end, what parts of the world would be so-called safe. Now, understand, again, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen. Emphasize, I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but I want to give you a scenario based on real-time events. I do absolutely believe that if we're not headed for World War III, we're going to get really close to that, to where it looks like we're headed for World War III. And I absolutely believe that something catastrophic like a World War III would be the necessity to enter into a beast system, one where people would give all authority to a singular system of world dominance. So I do believe that. So if that is to happen, if that war is to happen, what would it look like? What would your country look like? Would you be safe because you are Israel? Would you be safe from an atomic bomb? That's what we're going to talk about inside of this video. So stay tuned. We're going to get into this right now.
So we're about to play a video. This is a simulation of what a World War III could look like. I do want to just put in some disclaimers. I'm not saying that this is what's happening. This is not, or this is what's going to happen. That's not what I'm trying to claim. The point of playing this video is so that you understand where we are politically inside of this world, what things are being said by different nations, what nations are the aggressors, what nations are the ones that if they did come to blows, it would probably be within the next few years. These are things that are important to pay attention to, not because of us living out of fear, not because we live according to the dictates of this world, but because we have to, first of all, be a knowledgeable people. And second of all, we have to see when prophecy is being fulfilled through the actions of the world actors. Understand that this world, this political system, this spiritual system, all of it has groundings as far as scriptural references that are important enough that the Most High included them inside of his scriptures. So when you're given these types of signs and foretold how the world is going to go, and you see that happening right before your very eyes, you cannot just ignore it because it's going to bother you or upset your day, or because your emotional state can't take it. Understand, he's been warning us for a reason, and that reason is because there's going to be a time where we have to make a decision. What are we going to do? Are we going to allow ourselves to be inculpated into the system, or are we going to resist the system? So these are just some thoughts to put forward. It's an interesting video. We're going to just jump right into it. So I just wanted to lay that groundwork before we get started. So let's go.
Negotiations are over. The weapons are on high alert, and World War III is imminent. Where's the best place to be, and which countries are destined to be destroyed in the biggest global conflict in 80 years? The answer is a little more complicated than it appears. To start, we need to figure out what World War III is likely to mean.
What World War III is likely to mean. This is an important thing to emphasize because the world has been at war as far as regional conflicts. We've never seen a World War III, World War I, or World War II that started inside of the entire globe. It was always just the main powers, the Babylonian system, if we will, that was fighting against each other, fighting for control, fighting for the place of being the leader of the world order. So it's important to emphasize World War III might not mean every single country's at war, but if the most powerful countries are at war, according to this system, that is World War III. That is what it would be. So let's keep that in mind.
The world has had plenty of conflicts in the last few decades. but they're usually either a powerful country imposing its will on a smaller one or invading it for a specific purpose, like we're seeing in Ukraine right now and Iraq in the early 2000s. There have also been thorny regional conflicts, like the constant border skirmishes between India and Pakistan, but none have exploded into World War III.
I just want to emphasize this again because I know some people are going to come on the video and say what they're saying in this video is not true. All of the world is going to be brought into the next world war. It's not just going to be European nations or America and certain powers. There's not going to be nowhere safe on earth. To be clear, every single war, as far as the big wars, the world wars, it was not every single country included. It was the main powers, the ones who really controlled the ways of the world. Those ones were coming to clashes, and that's why we call it World War, because the world system as it was designed was brought into the war. But it doesn't mean that, for example, in the case of World War I, World War II, Africa was being brought into the war to the same degree that a Germany or a France. In fact, the African colonies, they drafted their subjects into the war, but that was not a situation where it was a home battlefront inside of the continent of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia. So let's keep going.
And when it does happen, we'll probably know it. World War III is likely to involve two major blocks of nations around the world. On one side, we'll see the US and its NATO allies, most of Western Europe along with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. India and Israel, both of which have strong ties to the bloc, are likely to work with them as well. Then in the other corner, we have the United States' two closest rivals for the superpower crown, Russia and China. While the two countries aren't in perfect harmony over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they both view the US as their chief rival and are likely to work in sync if a war breaks out.
So this is something that should be emphasized right here. So again, in the event of a world war, all of these things are happening as we speak. If you watch the news, if you watch the president of the United States, the president of France, if you watch the chancellors of Germany, if you watch these political leaders, what are they showing you? They're showing you that there's a divide in the world. The divide being Western nations, which includes Japan, versus this is the new axis of evil. They're saying it's Russia and China and obviously Iran and North Korea, countries that for many, many years have been pitted against the Western nations. Now, something else though I want to emphasize as far as India, I think India would either try to remain neutral or would probably go with the China and Russia, given the BRIC situation. And Israel, I think Israel, my personal belief would be that Israel tries to maintain neutrality, or if not, will at some point switch to the side of Russia and China. And if you want to know why I believe that, you can watch the video that I did on Second Ezra's as far as what is the prophetic destiny of the state of Israel. We know the state of Israel is not biblical Israel. So what is the prophetic destiny as far as that country? I don't think it would necessarily go with the United States. It could try to maintain neutrality and at a later time go with Russia and China or something of that mix. So let's keep going.
China would likely pull its two nuclear-armed allies, Pakistan and North Korea, along with the ambitious Iranians who are looking to join the nuclear club, a small group only joined by a select few other nations, but certainly a powerful bloc in terms of military strength. And this conflict will start in a familiar place. World War III isn't likely to break out from nowhere. It'll be the continuation of ongoing conflicts. The most likely flashpoint is in Eastern Europe. If Russia takes the continued supply of NATO weapons to Ukraine as a declaration of war, or attacks a NATO nation directly, it would trigger Article 5 and bring all NATO members into the war.
Or if, and this is the other scenario that I believe would probably be a trigger into the war, but I don't know obviously, but if Ukraine were to lose that war that the West has been putting billions of dollars into, then I think that would be enough, if not for the U.S. to outwardly announce a declaration of war or for NATO to announce a declaration of war. I think that would be enough to prompt some type of workings within the government to basically ensure that the war does happen. So whether they're trying to frame a certain country like Russia or China, saying that this country used nuclear weapons, did something of that like, I think that trigger when Ukraine loses, because I think it's very clear they're about to lose this war. When they lose, I think that that would be enough to trigger a response that's going to basically be a declaration of war from NATO.
Likewise, if Russia wins the war in Ukraine and declares it Russian territory, then it might just view NATO's presence on its border as a provocation. And just like it did in 1939, the battle for Europe would begin. And when one conflict breaks out, others are sure to follow.
I don't see that happening. I don't think that Russia is looking for World War III. However, it's very clear that the West really is looking for World War III. And that's another thing that you should question is why. Why are they looking to go to war and possibly end their civilization? But everything that doesn't make sense, everything that doesn't connect, there's scriptural references that show us that this is not just politics. There is literally a spiritual battle going on that none of us can see. None of us are privy to exactly what's happening in the spirit realm. That's something that is so important for you to understand. So I always felt like with Joe Biden and what NATO were doing, because they did provoke Russia into this war, to be very clear. That's historically accurate. I've always felt it was very interesting to see these countries trying to go to war with another nuclear power, and it didn't make sense as far as what I see, as far as the natural. But as far as the supernatural, the things that we don't see, there are things that are happening right now that we'll never be able to know, especially if you're not in prayer, as far as you're not in fasting, if you're not hearing from Yah, if you're not reading his scripture. There's some things that just won't make sense. And this is one of those things that I absolutely think that there's more things happening in the spirit than what we see happening in the natural.
Ukraine is to Russia what Taiwan is to China. The larger power has never given...
Sorry, there's an ad. One moment.
Up the hope of reclaiming it even after decades, and in China's case, they've never ever acknowledged Taiwan as an independent nation. The chaos in Europe has created the perfect chance for China to move on Taiwan and try to conquer it without getting into a larger war, hoping that the United States, which has pledged to defend Taiwan, would be too busy to jump into the fray.
And that's going to happen, by the way. We don't know when, of course, but it's very clear China is not going to let Taiwan go. They are, if anything, they're being very analytical because they just saw what happened, how the West pounced on Russia, how the world pounced on Russia, how Russia was depleted of so much money through sanctions, so much of its resources. So they're playing their cards wisely, but China is going to invade Taiwan. I think that is very established. That is in their history that they've seen this country as being, it was a part of China. So it's not really up for debate. And they are going to reclaim it. That's something that's within their plans that they have put forward, that Taiwan will become a part of China again. So the question is, what's going to be the catalyst, or what are they waiting to see happen in order to take that next move? Again, these are the things that we don't know yet, but I'm very sure that this is going to happen.
Of course, if that gambit fails, we're likely to have a shooting war between the US and China across the Pacific Ocean. And this explosion of conflict could lead to more flare-ups. Would North Korea take advantage of China's move on Taiwan to launch its own assault on South Korea? Would the ongoing India-Pakistan border conflicts break into something larger? Would the mullahs of Iran finally attempt to destroy Israel and potentially trigger retaliation from the secret nuclear power? Who else will get involved? And who will be left standing?
In case you caught that, the secret nuclear power, because Israel is a nuclear power.
Ending when the smoke clears. First, let's look at who's likely to come away scot-free. The safest...
Okay, so here's what we're talking about with set apart. Again, so we're supposed to be a chosen people. We're supposed to be out of this world system. And there's reasons why I advocate the global south, particularly the Holy Land, Africa. So there's reasons that I advocate for that region over other regions in the world, that this is a place where you can be set apart in many facets. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that Africa is not going to be a part of the New World Order. I'm not saying that Africa is not going to be brought into the system, because the scriptures tell us every single country will become a part of the beast empire. So I'm not saying that if you go to Africa or South America or Haiti, or Caribbean, sorry. I'm not saying if you go to one of these regions that you're going to escape the end times. It's, to me, more as of a warring stance. Are you able to wage war? Because that's what we have to do as people, God's people. I want to be very clear. We're not here to basically see this world system going and say, well, guess we're going with it. Guess we're going down with it. Understanding what this world system is about. They're not about Yeshua. They're not about his word. They're antichrist, right? So they're coming against that. They're going to persecute the children of Yah. So are we supposed to go with that system mindlessly like sheep? Or are we supposed to put ourselves in a battle position, in a offensive and defensive position? Or do we have that capacity within the West? I mean, that's a question for you. Do you feel like if the system were to basically seize the power that it is destined to seize in this here and now moment, that you would be able to resist it? Not just resist it, continue with the kingdom of Yah, because we're not supposed to ever let go of the fact that we are his people. We're supposed to share his message, and we're supposed to war for his kingdom. Are you able to do that under those circumstances in the West? So again, this is not saying that Africa is not going to fall to these things, or the global south is not going to fall to the world system, the new world order. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that there are places where you have a strategic advantage in order to be able to resist colonialism, because of the geography, because of the decentralization and the lack of militarization, because of the lack of regulation, because of the lack of organization by the state, things that we might look at as negative, but when you're trying to be separate from a world system, it's very much positive. And so this is what this part is about. Where in the world would probably not be brought into World War III, at least in the same manner? I think that they're trying to bring these countries in through proxy, but I don't think that they're going to be brought in as far as the direct target of the aggression, because these are not the countries that we're seeing having a divide as we speak. So let's talk about the countries that they say, that, according to this video, again, we don't know if this is true or not, but according to this video, these are the countries that would be safe in the event of a World War III.
This continent to be in the outbreak of World War III might just be South America. The continent is heavily dominated by mainstream left-wing parties and have friendly relations with both the US and Russia. So the odds are they'll stay neutral in the conflict. All these countries are democracies, with the exception of the chaotic Venezuela.
I do not support this depiction of Venezuela, but just watch this video for context.
Also working in their favor is the fact that no South American country has nuclear weapons, and most have militaries only designed for domestic use.
Okay, so hear that. Most South American military countries do not have nuclear weapons, and most do not have militaries for international use, but for domestic use. So a few things about that. I hear a lot of people say Africa needs nuclear weapons. Africa needs nuclear weapons. If you don't know, actually, Africa had nuclear weapons at one time. They were in South Africa. But guess what happened? Apartheid ended. The white rule of South Africa ended, and the West demanded that South Africa, as a condition for the end of apartheid, turn in their nuclear weapons. No joke. So Africa had them at one point, but the problem with nuclear weapons is that you have to, if you're really going to be able to defend your territory, you have to be able to meet the threat of your aggressors. And it's not just the getting nuclear weapons, and that's getting nuclear weapons in itself is very difficult, almost impossible. It's not just getting the nuclear weapons, and I say it's difficult and impossible, one, because of the resources and things that you need to be able to do that, but number two, because Western countries will do everything that they can to prevent you from getting one, including coups and things of that nature. But again, it's not just the getting of nuclear weapons, it's the ability to propel nuclear weapons that come from other territories towards you. It's missile defense systems. It's the ability to get your nuclear weapon where you're trying to get it, because just the having nuclear weapons is not going to protect you. In this simulation, they suggest that countries that do not have nuclear weapons are less likely to be brought into the conflict. Now, you might say nuclear weapons are a deterrent, meaning nuclear weapons are supposed to scare your enemies to back down. I think that that is true to an extent. I think in Russia, nuclear weapons are a deterrent because, again, Russia has the ability to block nuclear weapons and get nuclear weapons to anywhere in the world that they want to put them or aim them. That's not the case with every nuclear power. Not every nuclear power has that same ability. China has that ability. We know the US has that ability. But does every country have that technological ability? No. And so if you're not able to do that, then it's probably not a deterrent. It's actually probably something that's going to make you a target. We have to take out this country because this is the country in Africa that has nuclear weapons. We have to go after them first. So that's just to say nuclear weapons in themselves are not in themselves a solution. Now, the other thing that they mentioned, though, in this video, militaries use for domestic use. Now, we should understand this video was actually incorrect in their analysis because particularly inside of the global south, principally in Africa with AFRICOM, we should understand that these militaries are being funded by the military-industrial complex and being set up by the military-industrial complex. There's very few countries that have a completely independent military, whether it's the US that's funding and sponsoring, whether it's Russia or China. Most militaries, as far as the poorer countries, the colonized countries, these militaries are set up for proxy. So what it means is that you might not be the aggressor, the target of the biggest aggressor, but you will be a target of the proxies of those big aggressors. To give you a scenario, let's say that America's AFRICOM headquarters of Kenya, a major country where operations are launched out of, let's say that country now goes at a country that's been closely allied with Russia. So like, let's say Chad. So let's say we have an internal struggle between Chad and Kenya. I mean, that's a scenario where you could see two different military arms going at each other in the African continent because their overlords are telling them, hey, this is what you need to do right now because we're at war. So those are just some scenarios I want to give you.
Not only are they unlikely to get involved directly in any conflict, but there isn't likely to be any motivation for a country to invade them. While it's possible they could be used as a staging ground for attacks to the north, there are much easier ways to attack the United States. Thus, the only thing South America likely has to worry about in World War III is nuclear fallout drifting their way if everything gets completely out of control.
Of course, the world will have to worry about that.
They're not the only countries that can breathe easy. Probably the most remote country in the world, New Zealand, is in a lucky position. While it's firmly aligned with the Western Bloc and its fate is closely tied to that of its much larger neighbor Australia, it's more likely to avoid trouble for one simple reason. Australia is a pretty good shield. Australia is a massive nation that's closely tied to NATO and hosts the US and
Okay, this have another ad, which is fine because I want to skip this part. I don't think what he's saying is not necessarily true about New Zealand, especially Australia being the shield. But they're talking about nuclear war again. They're not necessarily talking about the bringing of the battlefront to your actual country. So let's listen more about what they're talking about.
really find itself occupied by a foreign army. But would these invaders proceed to New Zealand? The answer is probably not. New Zealand doesn't pose much of a threat militarily and is one of the most remote countries in the world. If they didn't get directly involved, New Zealand might be able to ride out the war. And as Australia is unlikely to be targeted by nuclear weapons, fallout will likely not be a threat. And the same goes for a continent that's breathing a sigh of relief.
Okay, so here we are. He says that continent is breathing a sigh of relief. So let's see if we agree with his analysis of what would happen with Africa in the event of a World War III.
For hundreds of years, Africa has been treated as an all-you-can-eat buffet by colonial powers, with almost all the countries on the continent being invaded, colonized, and looted of their resources and even their people. Today,
And what people do you? What people other than the African continent? What people have dealt with this type of atrocities after atrocity after atrocity after atrocity like us? No one else like us. Which is why I laugh when people try to deny that we are the children of Israel.
they have a complex relationship with the world's great powers. But many countries are seeing their economies grow at an astonishing rate, and other countries investing in factories and talent there. China, in particular, has seen its investment in the continent grow, with many key factories producing high-tech components used in military warfare being hosted in these nations. Africa has no nuclear powers, and its militaries are unlikely to get involved directly in any conflict. So the most likely problem Africa is going to face is dealing with rival powers interfering in each other's investments. But for other countries, prospects are thorny.
So I think that, again, this is drastically optimistic, because the other issue with having different countries' investments is that Africa is the center of natural resources. So, number one, these countries rely on Africa. That could be a benefit to where, because they rely on Africa, they try not to attack Africa directly, or it could also be a detriment. In order to kill your enemy's supply line, let me go take this mine that they have inside of this continent. So this could go for both ways. Like I said, I'm not overly optimistic that in the event of a World War III, there's not going to be any smoke brought to Africa, or Africa's not going to face proxy wars or things of that nature. But I do think, as far as direct conflict, as far as the nuclear powers who they're going to go at, I don't believe that a nuclear bomb would be dropped in the African continent unless, and this is believed, unless it was done so to flex nuclear capabilities, as it was inside of Japan. You know, if you don't know the history of the atomic bomb in Japan, they didn't have to drop that bomb. They did it to flex. As far as Russia seeing that, oh, we can do something that's going to wipe many of your people. Now, of course, it backfired, because now Russia's like, well, I guess we need a nuclear bomb. And I guess we need to flex with that nuclear bomb too. But they tend to do that in places that are remote. I think if the West were to try to do that inside of the African continent, it would need a very compelling narrative, because one thing that they are very mindful of is that they're losing their reputation across the world, particularly in the global South, and they're being labeled correctly as a colonial imperialist nation that has only been aggressive with Africa, correctly labeled that way. And they do want to better their image in that regard. But again, just to emphasize, it's very, very possible that that could be used as a way to scare other nations, but I don't think it's probable. More than likely, you'll see the big countries being targets of nuclear aggression if that were to go down.
Could the United States survive World War III? Well, they have a few advantages.
Okay, so my people in the U.S., this is what the simulation says about your chances of surviving World War III.
One thing, they're relatively isolated away from main flashpoints, which also allowed them to experience minimal conflict on the home front during the first two world wars. But this time, there's an additional threat: nuclear weapons, which means that the enemies can hit any country anywhere in the world. It's believed only Russia and China have the ability to hit the US homeland right now, with North Korea trying to join the party. The US is also very spread out, with dozens of cities dotted around the world's third largest country. While it could sustain some massive hits if the war goes nuclear, it's well equipped to survive. And if its survival is truly in danger, so is the rest of the world's. It's most vulnerable.
So this is something important to emphasize, is that a nuclear bomb could hit somewhere in the United States. Now, nuclear bombs are not what they used to be. Let me emphasize that. They used to be a lot smaller in scope. The nuclear bombs that exist today could wipe out like much more territory than the ones in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's just something important to emphasize. But even so, let's say one nuclear bomb went into the United States. That's an advantage, they say, is that America would not necessarily be wiped off the map. You could still have the United States. A majority of the country could not be hit, which means that certain parts of the U.S. could be used as a sacrificial lamb without destroying the empire in itself.
Vulnerable areas might be its Pacific holdings, including the state of Hawaii and the territory of Guam. and its neighbors are largely in the same boat. There's a reason there isn't likely to be any major conflict on North American soil. All of the countries there are relatively friendly with each other. Canada is a member of NATO and a close ally of the US, and the two are likely to be on the same side. Relations with Mexico can be a little chillier, and the country was famously approached to join Germany in World War I with the promise of reclaiming its lost territory, but it's not likely to actively side against the United States. These two countries aren't likely to be targeted directly during the war, except in a full-scale nuclear barrage. Although Canada is uniquely vulnerable in some ways, that's because despite being the world's second largest country, the vast majority of its population is located in less than 10 cities, less than an hour from the US border. And in the same boat is one of the ringleaders of the other side. China is likely to be a key player in World War III along with Russia, as the leaders of the forces opposing the US and its allies. But it's in a better position strategically. For one thing, the belligerent Vladimir Putin is likely to provoke retaliation from his enemies with big, flashy war.
Again, I do not necessarily, I do not co-sign these depictions of Putin. I'm not a Putin advocate, but I can see very clearly when we're being sold an agenda. If you don't know, every single time that the West wants to get you ready for war, they have to find a boogeyman. So they had to find a Saddam Hussein, they had to find a Osama bin Laden, they had to find every single war there has to be a boogeyman, so right now the boogeyman of this moment is Vladimir Putin, and of course we have the historical ones, the North Korean leader, and we have leader of Iran, and all of these, obviously China's president. So they have to do this, drum up your emotions. That's why I'm trying to emphasize, this is not necessarily accurate. I don't agree with this depiction of Putin, but this is the boogeyman that they're going to make the boogeyman of the world war, I believe.
War crimes, while the ruthless Xi Jinping will be able to stay further under the radar. China is also roughly the size of the United States and is the most populous country in the world. If things escalate to nuclear weapons, the country will likely take some massive hits, probably from the US, but also possibly from India. But it would be very hard for its enemies to destroy the country without endangering the future of all life on Earth. The same can't be said for these countries. These are the ones that are in the biggest danger of being wiped off the map. We have to start.
Okay, so just some things about China that I want to emphasize. He said China could probably stay under the radar as far as nuclear conflict. I think that is very possible. Sometimes I get the vibe that China, that this whole, Russia alliance is doing so strategically because of what's about to happen with Taiwan, and that they're trying to position themselves not just to be a go to war, but to survive the war, which you might just say that's just smart. I mean, that's intelligent, but I'm trying to make the point that I think that they're not trying to be the scapegoat the same way that Putin is being used by the West to drum up fear and emotions, because China is ultimately interested in their economic expansion, as we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years. That is where their bread and butter is, and they're not trying to jeopardize their position in that type of way.
Start with the most vulnerable countries in the case of World War III breaking out, Ukraine and Taiwan. If this global war starts, it'll likely start right there, and some might say it already has. Right now, Ukraine is turning the tide on Russia. They're supplied with heavy-duty NATO artillery.
As you can probably guess, this video was made, let me see, when was this video actually made? It was made, 5 months ago, so their views of what was happening with Ukraine was a lot more ambivalent than what it probably would be today. So they're of the expectation that Ukraine could win the war, which is not going to happen. But let's listen.
And are shooting down Russian planes and blowing up their ships, while Russia is limited to committing indiscriminate war crimes with an army increasingly staffed by draftees. But if Putin gets backed into a corner and starts using nuclear weapons, the tide could turn very quickly, and Ukraine could see its largest cities destroyed in a flash.
Okay, so while that ad's going, the other possibility is, because I don't think that Putin wants to use nuclear weapons, but the other possibility is that the West would, if not provoke Putin to use nuclear weapons, try to kind of fake a nuclear disaster, which we've seen with these different power plants or whatnot that are vulnerable because of the war. That would be another cause, I think, to be a trigger for this conflict to expand.
From there, it would be overrun, and the devastated country would become little more than a staging ground for Putin's next conquest, and the same could happen half a world away. China is less likely than Russia to use nuclear weapons against Taiwan, mostly due to Taiwan's small size. Such an attack could destroy the small island, but because of China's ambition to reincorporate the nation, it is unlikely. In order to do that, it would likely start with a shock and awe attack, hitting Taiwan with a naval assault, blasting through its defenses, and likely causing mass destruction as well as loss of power and access to resources in its largest city, Taipei. This would all happen very fast, and while Taiwan could likely hold out for a while, China has more resources and deadlier weapons. Unless the United States got directly involved and started firing back,
which is going to happen. So you might want to ask the question, I asked the question, why has the United States for so long had so much naval presence inside of the Pacific? It doesn't make the most sense, especially when you think about the fact that the Pacific, that's not a region that is even culturally harmonious with the Western culture. So why the amped military presence? And I think you can even compare the military presence in the Pacific to something like in the Middle East, so-called Middle East. And so the reason why that is because for a long time, they've been trying to ward off China and trying to prepare themselves to go to war with China. So when you see all of these military bases in Japan and Guam and Philippines and all of these countries in the Pacific, strategic reason for that. Don't take anything as coincidence. This is something that's been thought of for a long time in order to combat China.
Taiwan would likely still exist as a plot of land, but the nation, its government, and the people would become nothing more than a pawn and a hostage for China. Back in Europe, Ukraine isn't the only country in danger. Putin's had his sights on access to the Baltic Sea for a long time, and its only water access is limited. The odds are these small nations would be the first on the chopping block once Putin triumphs over Ukraine and World War III is on. All these countries, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, are in NATO, but any pretenses of respecting that larger alliance are likely out the window at this point. Putin would be looking to reclaim its borders of the old Soviet Union, and these countries all border.
Okay, I'm going to go forward some. I don't particularly agree with this analysis, but let's go forward some.
That's comforting. In Asia, it's a different story. China's military is newer and more effective than Russia's, so the odds are they'd take a different approach. They've been dealing the death of 1,000 cuts to many nearby nations already, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines. They've been taking over the territorial waters, creating artificial islands to serve as military bases, and declaring the entire South China Sea as their territorial waters.
Which is very intelligent. Listen, you got to point out intelligence when you see it. The fact that, okay, we can't colonize a country in the here and now, number one, because it would be seen as a provocation against the civilian population, probably lead to more conflicts as far as our international reputation. Let's build some islands. Let's create some islands to have military bases on because, you know, obviously if China tries to have a military base inside of an actual country that is probably already allied with the United States, that's not going to go well diplomatically or not go, it could be a catalyst of a war. But if they're just creating an island and putting a military base on it, then that's a whole nother situation. We'll talk, I think, I don't want to say when. We'll definitely talk about one country in Africa that has a lot of military bases, in particularly China. I believe the first country to have a Chinese military base in Africa. We have to talk about that. But this is just a very interesting strategy.
None of these countries are prepared for a full-scale war against a major power, so odds are they'd be taken over quickly in the event of a war, with China using them as a staging ground for a larger conflict. That would possibly inflict massive damage on those nations, but would be unlikely to destroy them. The same can't be said for another neighbor. If there's a country in Asia that's most vulnerable besides Taiwan, it's probably Japan. The strongest economy in Asia besides China, it's a key U.S. ally, but it also doesn't have a particularly strong military due to World War II treaties.
Yeah, so Japan is such an interesting country to me because they are hosting the United States, despite the fact that the United States slaughtered so many of their people in World War II, particularly with the inhumane and illegal a dropping of 2 atomic bombs on civilian populations. So after that, you would think that they don't have ambivalence towards the US, but they do. And that's how the colonized mind works in the favor of the West. They can put their people in power and they can control the narrative and make people forget the worst atrocities, the most horrific crimes. And to this day, they have a presence in Japan that is very, very strong. That country is military, is the US military. Makes no sense, right? But that's how things have been operating for a long time.
Relies heavily on the United States for its defense and houses a large number of soldiers and military bases, which makes it an inviting target for a Chinese attack. This would be seen as a 2-for-1 benefit if war breaks out over Taiwan. Not only would China be potentially kneecapping the American fleet, but it would be getting long-awaited revenge on Japan for the devastation caused by Imperial Japan on China almost a century ago.
Which is very devastating, by the way. This is interesting if you understand what's happening in the world today, because if you remember, whenever the aggression was happening as far as Taiwan, and China was pissed off because the United States ignored their warnings to not go to visit Taiwan when Pelosi led that visit to Taiwan, the congressional visit. And what was one of the responses? You started hearing about planes flying by Japan. So Japan is definitely in the line of fire. In fact, that's probably one of the most unsafe places you could be as far as a World War III situation.
Japan become both the first and second country to be hit by a nuclear weapon? It depends on how much China wants to escalate, but it's definitely the most likely initial target for China in the region. And if China and the US go to war, there are a lot of countries in the way. What do Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Nauru have in common? They're all some of the smallest countries in the world. And they're also in the way if a war breaks out between the United States and China. They're part of a network of small island nations in Oceania, along with Vanuatu, Fiji, Samoa, Micronesia, and the Solomon Islands, and the Cook Islands. And if a full Pacific War breaks out, odds are they'll be quickly invaded by whichever country gets there first. They're closer to China, which makes occupation by them more likely. And while it's unlikely that they'd be hit by...
Let's go forward some to North Korea right here.
...the leash off and say, go to town. That would be an effective way to keep South Korea occupied while they go after U.S. interests. But things could get out of control very quickly. Both Koreas are small nations, and North Korea could deliver a devastating blow to its enemy by using its short-range nuclear weapons to wipe Seoul off the map, clearing the way for an invasion into a destabilized country. But they might get more than they counted on. For one thing, using nuclear weapons on their close neighbor might lead to significant fallout hitting North Korea. But more dangerously, North Korea would immediately become a top target for the US, and likely to be targeted with massive bombing raids, if not nuclear retaliation. It's very likely that if a full-on conflict between the two Koreas broke out in the middle of World War III, neither country would be in functioning shape by the time it was over.
So interesting thing about this is an important lesson to remember as far as North Korea, because again, who are boogeymen inside of the media? North Korea, Putin, so Russia, China, the countries that pose a risk to the United States are the boogeymen of the world. So propaganda, pointing that out, propaganda is something that is always used in order to prep you for war and make you zealous for the cause of your country, even if that cause goes against your own interest.
Are neighbors, and while they're both large countries, a large-scale nuclear conflict could likely bring fallout into both nations. They're also densely populated. Both are in the top 10 most populated nations, with India in the cusp of first place. So any conflict would come with massive loss of life. The case scenario, if a conflict breaks out, is that both countries would stick to conventional weapons, resulting in a conflict full of death and destruction, but without the earth-shaking weapons that could turn both countries into wastelands.
Which is worth emphasizing. All because a nuclear weapon is not used does not mean that millions of people are not going to die. Think about how many people are dying in these different wars that have been happening for decades. Think about the war in Sudan, as far as Darfur, the Congo wars. Think about the war in Syria. I mean, just the numbers are off the charts. No nuclear weapons used there. So even if your country is not in the line of nuclear fire, that does not mean that your country is going to necessarily bear well inside of a World War III situation. We're going to go forward again. I want to talk about Israel, and I think we'll probably leave it off with that. After this ad, one moment.
firmly aligned with the American side, it might choose not to send troops to any combat theater.
Okay, let me go back just a little bit. I want to make sure we get the full spill of this.
Mediterranean nation is between a rock and a hard place, and while it would likely be firmly aligned with the American side, it might choose not to send troops to any combat theater. That's because it tries to maintain good relations with Russia, both because of the Jewish population in the former Soviet Union and because Russia plays a key role in Syria, Israel's northern neighbor.
So, worth emphasizing, Israel is not, if you don't see what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, for example, Israel is not coming out against Russia the same way as the West, which is surprising because where does Israel get its ability to survive from monetarily and militarily? From the United States. So you would think that they would take the same stance with them as far as the war in Russia. They have not. And I think the reason why is because they have plans to go and exist far past the end of this war. And if you want some more reference, you can check out the video again. I did on Second Ezra's as far as this eagle, these heads. The first head rises and descends. The second head rises and descends. The third head, I believe, is a Zionist world order or world positioning. Israel, I believe, will position itself to possibly take the crown from the Western nations following a situation like a World War III. And also worth emphasizing as far as Ukraine, Ukraine and Israel have a lot of the same population. A lot of the Ukrainians moved to Israel whenever the state was invented. So this is another reason why Israel's role inside of a world conflict is kind of measured as far as how they react and how they go forward, because they don't try to put out the aggressive stance that the West does as far as Russia.
If Russia thought Israel was betraying it, it could easily unleash its proxies in Syria to rain rockets down on the small country and cause major casualties that Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system couldn't prevent. But while Israel might not be looking for a fight, the fight might come to Israel. There's no country that Israel has worse relations with than Iran, especially after the former president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad threatened to wipe it off the map. As Iran ramps up its nuclear program, Israel is on high alert to potentially attack its infrastructure like it did to Iraq and Syria in the past. But
just remember what we said, the nuclear strategy is of the United States, or the military strategy of the United States is in the so-called Middle East. That is that they prioritize oil and Israel. So Iran, that's why Iran has been one of your boogeymen as far as the Western media.
Would Iran strike first? The current president has denied the Holocaust happened and threatened Israel repeatedly, so it might decide that a global conflict is a great opportunity to make its move. If it used conventional weapons, Israel would likely respond tenfold, and a new bloody regional conflict would kick off. But there's one deadly X factor here. If Iran was able to finish its nuclear weapon, or get help from North Korea or another rogue nation, it could attempt to hit Israel and wipe the tiny country out. Israel has a robust missile defense system, so there's a chance it could divert the hit and avoid a nuclear blast. But successful or not, an attempted nuclear attack would likely trigger massive retaliation, and Israel would almost definitely respond to a successful nuclear hit with its own secret nuclear arsenal, and it likely has enough to turn Iran into a shell of its current self. So if things spiral out of control, it's possible both Israel and Iran could face existential threats. And there's one more country in the...
So, as you see, Israel has a secret stock of nuclear weapons, and it's a well-known secret. Is it a secret anymore? So, I'll end this right there, this video, countries that will be destroyed because of World War III. You can watch the full video. It's something that gives you a scenario that could play out based on where the world is today. Doesn't mean that this is what's going to happen. Doesn't mean that this is sure to happen. But I think that you should also think about this as a way to understand where you are living. Are you living in the crosshairs? Are you living right under the target of a worldwide catastrophe? And if so, are you putting yourself inside of a position to where if the system falls, you will not fall with it? Let me see if I can find my scriptural reference so that I can just end off on that note. Deliver thyself, O Zion, that dwelleth with the daughter of Babylon. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory hath he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you. For he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. For behold, I will shake mine hand upon them, and they shall be spoiled to their servants. And ye shall know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me. This is just a reminder that this place, Babylon, has a prophecy against it. And will you be there in Babylon when the prophecy manifests? Don't think that you'll necessarily won't be there. I don't personally believe that Israel's going to be airlifted out of the territories where we are being oppressed. I do think that we have to take physical moves as far as not putting ourselves in the line of fire. And so this is something for you to pray on, something for you to think on, not something for you to panic on, but something for you to be spiritually aware of. Study the scriptures, read it for what it says, not what you want it to say, and always go to the Most High, because he is your source, your guide, your light, not the media, not different YouTube personalities. That is the one who you should go to first and foremost about every single decision that you make. But with that, I'm going to end this video. I thank you all for watching. I will see you all in the next video.
Inside Washington's Museum of the Bible, a single volume that is like no other. The so-called Slave Bible, remarkable not for what's in it, but for what's not.
So about 90% of the Old Testament's been removed, and about 50% of the New Testament's been removed. To put it another way, a normal King James Version has 1,189 chapters in it. The Slave Bible has only 232.
Missing are chapters and verses that might have encouraged uprisings. Book of Exodus, redacted. No story of Moses demanding Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Gone is Galatians, and the verse, "There is neither bond nor free, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." And no Jeremiah, "Woe unto him that useth his neighbor's service without wages."
What they've left in are verses such as Ephesians 6:5, which is the famous verse, "Slaves, be obedient to your master."
Looking at the
This is First African Baptist Church, the oldest black church in North America. The building, built by slaves. The gentleman that laid the first brick laid the last. The balcony hold pews that actually were built by slaves. They have the oldest information in this building. That information is written in cursive Hebrew writing.
Something came to us earlier about who we were, and that we were direct descendants. My family is direct descendants from Harriet Tubman, and she's from the same area that this tribe is visiting Philadelphia from. And so we had to come and worship with you guys today. And we're super excited. It's just a thrill right now to be a part of this whole celebration.
And so, brother and sister, what was Harriet Tubman's name before she changed her name to Harriet? And what significance does that have to us as Hebrews?
Her name was, before she changed her name after she ran away, her name was Araminta Ross. And Araminta is a Hebrew name. Her family knew that they were from the Ashanti tribe, and which is now part of Ghana, and that they were Hebrew. They did have Hebrew names before they were in slavery.
Thank you so much.
And as we read a little bit, you can find the Ashanti tribe actually in the Old Testament. The Ashant, I believe, is Ashant, which is now interpreted in Shantae. So yeah, so it was really exciting to find someone that is actually our descendant who is Hebrew and from right out of the book.
Harriet Tubman became known as the Moses of her people due to her contributions in facilitating the Underground Railroad. What is often not taught regarding Harriet is that she was given a Hebrew name at birth. Additionally, many of her relatives carried names of Hebrew origin. Harriet's birth name was Aramanita, which is a given name in Hebrew meaning lofty, noble, or elevated in character and spirit. Here we have provided a short list of a few of her relatives, along with the meaning of their names in Hebrew. Harriet's sister, Lina, Hebrew name meaning dwelling or lodging. Harriet's sister, Maria, Hebrew name meaning Yahuwah has said, or Yahuwah is my teacher. Harriet's brother, Ben, Hebrew name meaning son, with the full rendering Benjamin, meaning son of my right hand. Harriet's sister, Rachel, Hebrew name meaning or little lamb. Harriet's brother, Moses, name meaning to deliver or to draw out. Harriet's niece, Keziah, Hebrew name generally understood as meaning sweet scented spice. Through the collaborative efforts of researchers at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute of Harvard University, and other research institutions around the world, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database has already provided empirical evidence that thousands of the men, women, and children who were transported from the shores of Africa had names of Hebrew origin. Though the slave owners deliberately stripped away much of their language and customs, we can still see evidence that our forefathers, who were led away into captivity, maintained some recollection of their heritage and identity.